Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to another episode of our channel, where shadows become stories and fear comes to life. Today, we will bring you chilling tales that will send shivers down even the bravest spines. But before we dive into this world of horrors, we want to know where you're watching from. Leave your location in the comments and help us understand how far our tales are reaching. Get ready to feel the chills, because the night is just beginning. I never thought much about horror stories. I was always the skeptical type, the kind of person who looks for logical explanations in everything. But there are some things you can't unsee, and after that night, I've come to understand a kind of fear that reason can't touch. It was a quiet night, the kind where every sound in the house feels louder. My parents were away on a weekend trip, and my sister was sleeping over at a friend's house. I was alone, free to do whatever I wanted. I ended up spending hours playing video games in the dim glow of my screen, headphones on, completely immersed. By the time I looked at the clock, it was almost 3 in the morning. I sighed, turned everything off, and dragged myself to bed, ready to fall asleep the second my head hit the pillow. I had barely gotten comfortable when I heard something, just a small sound. It was distant, faint, like it came from the other side of the house. I told myself it was nothing, just the old house creaking, maybe a branch scraping against a window. I even closed my eyes again, ready to drift off, but then the sound came again, closer this time. It was strange, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it must be my imagination, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened closely. Silence. But that's when I realized the sound had come from the direction of the living room. I decided to investigate, feeling both stupid and scared as I crept through the hallway. The only light was from the street lamp outside, casting weird, jagged shadows across the walls. I held my breath as I reached the doorway to the living room, half expecting to see something there. But there was nothing, just the stillness of an empty room. I started to relax, laughing a little at myself for being so jumpy, when I noticed the floor. There, right in the middle of the living room, was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the front door all the way to the hallway. They looked fresh, and they hadn't been there earlier. My skin prickled with a sense of dread, but I forced myself to follow the trail. The footprints were smeared, as if someone had been dragging something, or someone. My heart was racing so loud I could barely hear anything else. The trail led directly to my bedroom door. The thought of someone, or something, being in my room while I was playing games, watching me without me even knowing, sent an icy shock through my body. I backed up slowly, not wanting to get any closer, but then I heard it again. A faint, scraping sound, coming from my bedroom. I felt rooted to the spot, frozen with fear, but I knew I had to look. I had to know if I was really alone. I stepped back into the hallway, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around, to run, but something kept pulling me forward. When I reached the door to my bedroom, I stopped. My hand shook as I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. My room was dark, just as I've left it. But in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a shape. It was hunched over, almost like it was crouching, staring at me. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one. All I could see was a dark, twisted form, with limbs too long and thin to belong to any person. It didn't move. It just watched, waiting, as if daring me to step closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, my legs finally started working again, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The thing in the corner didn't follow me. It stayed there, motionless, watching as I backed out of the room and closed the door behind me. I ran to the front door and locked myself in the car, too scared to go back inside. I spent the rest of the night there, staring at the house, waiting for any sign of movement in the windows. But the house stayed dark and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. In the morning, I forced myself to go back in, hoping to find some explanation, something that would make sense. But when I reached my bedroom, there was nothing. No footprints, no trail, and no sign of the dark shape in the corner. It was as if the entire thing had been a dream. But I know what I saw, and I know that something was there, something that came into my home that night. I still don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever want to. But every time I walk past my bedroom door, I feel like it's watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back. I never thought I would be the target of a stalker. I always considered myself a cautious person, someone who took care with personal safety. But what started as a small discomfort quickly turned into a nightmare that changed my life forever. The story begins on a Tuesday night when I got home after a long day at work. I was tired and eager to relax. While preparing dinner, I noticed that something felt off. The sensation of being watched began to creep in. I glanced out the kitchen window but saw only the empty street, dimly lit by streetlights. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to my room, where I started watching a series on my computer. But the discomfort lingered. I went to bed that night, but I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. For a while, I thought it was just my imagination until I started noticing strange things. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I found a note stuck to my car door. "You're beautiful," it read, written in a strange and awkward hand. My heart raced. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Just the morning's emptiness. In the days that followed, the situation worsened. The notes became a routine. Every time I went out, I would find messages in unexpected places, in the mailbox, under the windshield wiper, even on my hood. The contents of the messages varied from compliments to unsettling claims that he was always watching me. My mind was in turmoil, questioning who could be behind this and why I was the target. Each new note heightened my anxiety and fear, leaving me at a loss for what to do. I started changing my routines, coming and going from work at different times, taking alternate routes, but each day it felt more futile. The stalker seemed to be everywhere, like a shadow that wouldn't disappear. One night, after a long day at work, I returned home and went straight to my room. Upon entering, I sensed that something was wrong. The place was eerily quiet, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, as if the atmosphere were charged with tension. What unsettled me even more was the window in my room. It was slightly open, something I was sure I had closed before leaving. My instinct screamed at me to get out of the house, but I didn't know where to go. I decided to call the police, but the 911 operator seemed to doubt the severity of the situation, which only added to my frustration. "Just a note, miss. That doesn't sound like a threat," he said. After a few minutes, I insisted on having an officer sent over, but the feeling of helplessness consumed me. While I waited, I began to hear a noise coming from the hallway. A faint scratching sound, almost as if someone was moving slowly. My heart raced, and I knew I couldn't stay still. I left my room and headed to the living room, where the street light illuminated the entrance to the house. Adrenaline coursed through me as I looked outside, expecting to see a familiar face, but all I saw was darkness. Then a terrifying thought struck me. What if the stalker was already inside? My mind began to race. I decided to grab a knife from the kitchen and held it tightly, ready to defend myself. I heard the noise again, but now it seemed closer. Each step I took, each breath I drew, echoed in the silent house. The tension was palpable. With the knife in hand, I started searching the house, moving slowly to avoid making noise. With every corner I checked, my fear grew. When I reached my bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. My heart was in my throat as I turned the knob and pushed the door open. My room was dark, just as I had left it. But in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a shape. It was hunched over, almost as if it were crouching, staring at me. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one. All I could see was a dark, twisted form, with limbs too long and thin to belong to any person. It didn't move. It just watched, waiting, as if daring me to step closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, my legs finally started working again, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The thing in the corner didn't follow me. It stayed there, motionless, watching as I backed out of the room and closed the door behind me. I ran to the front door and locked myself in the car, too scared to go back inside. I spent the rest of the night there, staring at the house, waiting for any sign of movement in the windows. But the house stayed dark and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. In the morning, I forced myself to go back inside, hoping to find some explanation, something that would make sense. But when I reached my bedroom, there was nothing. No footprints, no trail, and no sign of the dark shape in the corner. It was as if the entire thing had been a dream. But I know what I saw, and I know that something was there, something that came into my home that night. I still don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever want to. But every time I walk past my bedroom door, I feel like it's watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back. When my grandfather passed away, we inherited his old house. For many, it would be a precious gift, but for me, it felt like a burden. The house, located in an isolated rural area, had a dark aura, as if the walls were soaked with secrets and stories from a past better left forgotten. Still, my family decided to move in, eager to restore it and breathe new life into it. I, on the other hand, had my reservations. On the first night, as darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive. The creaking floorboards were intense, as if every step I took reverberated through the walls. That night, I dreamed of dark figures floating through the hallways, but I awoke suddenly, my heart racing, feeling as though I was being watched. Over the following week, things began to get stranger. I heard whispers that seemed to emanate from within the walls, and some nights, an inexplicable chill filled the air, as if someone were nearby. One night, while exploring the attic for useful items, I came across an old trunk covered in dust. When I opened it, I found old photographs of a family I had never seen. In most of the pictures, they stood in front of the house, smiling. However, one image unsettled me. A shadowy figure lurked in the background, with a piercing and haunting gaze. I quickly closed the trunk, a sense of dread rising in my spine. In the following days, the strange occurrences intensified. My brother claimed to have seen a shadow pass him in the hallway and heard childlike laughter echoing at night. That same night, while trying to sleep, I heard the sound of a ball bouncing on the floor. At first, I thought it was my brother playing, but he was in his room, asleep. The sound continued, sending my heart into a frenzy. I got up cautiously and went to the living room, where I found a small soccer ball on the floor, even though no one else was there. The air was cold, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger by the second. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I spoke with the neighbors and discovered that the house had a tragic history. Years ago, a family had lived there, and a tragedy had struck them. One of the children, a boy named Thomas, had mysteriously disappeared, and the pain of the loss seemed to still haunt the place. The neighbors whispered about strange events that occurred in the house, claiming that Thomas's spirit still roamed there, searching for something he had lost. From then on, the phenomena became more intense. I could feel the presence of someone watching me, especially at night. Whispers turned into distant screams, and I could no longer ignore the call that seemed to come from deep within the house. One night, my curiosity overcame my fear. Armed with a flashlight, I descended into the basement, a place that had always terrified me. The air was heavy, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. As I advanced, a sweet and foul smell invaded my nostrils, and for a moment, I thought I would faint. Then, a sliver of light illuminated a wall, and I realized that something was written there in what appeared to be blood. "Help me, please." The words were accompanied by marks as if someone had tried to escape. My heart stopped. I knew I wasn't alone. I quickly turned to go back upstairs, but just as I reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut with a bang. The sound echoed like thunder, and I found myself trapped. Shadows seemed to intensify all around me, and a childlike laugh echoed off the walls. I began to pound on the door, screaming, but the laughter turned into cries, as if a child were pleading for help. Finally, the door opened by itself, and I fell backward. A pale, trembling figure appeared before me. It was a child, with large, sorrowful eyes, looking at me with a desperate expression. "He's coming," she whispered, before vanishing like smoke. I woke up the next morning in my room, gasping, as if I had gone through a horrific experience. I looked around and realized the house was silent, but the feeling that something was about to happen still hung in the air. From that day on, I decided I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The story surrounding Thomas was not just a legend, it was a terrifying truth. When I told my family what had happened, they were reluctant to believe me. But I knew I couldn't remain. A week later, we left the house behind, but the memories of the dark presence and the child pleading for help never left me. Sometimes, at night, I still hear the laughter of a child, and the feeling of being watched never completely disappears. Now, whenever I pass by an old house, I feel a chill run down my spine, knowing that some stories are better left untouched. The Road of Old Hollow is famous in our town, but not for pleasant reasons. They say it's cursed, and the stories that surround this road are told in whispers. The legends speak of mysterious accidents, missing persons, and, most importantly, a feeling of despair that envelopes everyone who ventures to drive along it. I had always heard these stories, but I never thought that one day I would have a terrifying experience on that very road. One night, I was returning home after an event with friends. It was getting late, and most people had already gone. I decided to take the Road of Old Hollow, despite the warnings. It was the shortest route, and I thought the stories were just tales to scare people. As soon as I entered the road, I sensed that the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, and the full moon illuminated the path in a sinister way. As I drove, fog began to form. Visibility got worse, and I had to slow down. The trees lining the road seemed to lean inward, as if trying to block my passage. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my tires on the pavement. It was then that I noticed something moving in my peripheral vision. A flash of light, a quick shadow darting between the trees. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the movement persisted, and the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing minute. Suddenly, my radio began to crackle, and a harsh static cut through the silence. I pressed the button to turn it off, but the music returned, playing an old song I didn't recognize. The whispering voices on the radio seemed to blend with the shadows dancing around my car. Then, the road narrowed even further, and I spotted a turnoff to the right. A rusted sign was partially covered in vegetation, but I could make out the words "Caution, Dangerous Road." A chill ran through my body. The turn looked inviting, but I knew it was risky. However, something inside me, an insatiable curiosity, compelled me to take it. As soon as I turned right, the road became even more dilapidated. The trees were denser, and the fog felt almost tangible. The music on the radio started to play again, but now it was louder, and a sense of panic began to creep through me. Then, I saw a figure on the road ahead. It was a woman, standing still. Her white dress swayed gently in the wind, and her dark hair fell over her shoulders. She looked so serene, but the way she stared at me sent chills down my spine. Fearing to stop, I accelerated, but as I approached, the woman turned and began to walk away. Something in her posture made me believe she was leading me somewhere. I decided to follow, thinking I could help. But as I pursued her, the road became increasingly narrow, and the moonlight seemed to fade away. When I finally got close enough, I realized her appearance was deteriorating. Her dress was stained, and her face looked like a mask of sadness and pain. Suddenly, she turned to me, and her eyes were filled with tears. "Help me," she whispered, and I felt a deep desperation in her voice. But before I could respond, she pointed towards the forest. Something inside me knew I shouldn't go, but the feeling that she needed help was unbearable. I decided I had to follow her indication. The interior of the forest was dark and frightening. The trees were so close that they seemed to be suffocating me. The whisper of the woman echoed in my mind as I walked, each step resonating as if the forest were alive. Then, something moved among the trees. A group of shadows began to form, drawing closer. They were indistinct figures, but their intentions were clear. I tried to turn back, but the feeling of being trapped intensified. The figures began to approach me, and I realized they were tormented souls. Their faces were recognizable, and each expression told a story of pain and despair. It was as if they were trying to warn me, but I couldn't understand what they wanted. The woman appeared again, now closer, but her expression was twisted, as if she were caught between two worlds. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice now stronger. "Leave while you still can." Fear consumed me, and without thinking, I ran back to the road. The air felt heavy, and the fog seemed to be trying to pull me back. Each step felt like a struggle, but I finally managed to reach my car. When I got in, I looked back, and the woman was there, staring at me with a look of deep sadness. Shadows surrounded her, and for the first time, I understood that she was a victim of the road's curse. Old Hollow Road was not just a path, but a portal to despair and pain. With trembling hands, I started the car and hit the accelerator. As I left the cursed road behind, the heavy atmosphere disappeared. But the image of the woman and the tormented faces stayed with me. Since that night, I never returned to Old Hollow Road. I believe some roads are better left unexplored, and some souls better left in peace. When I moved into my new house, I was excited to start a new chapter in my life. The neighborhood was quiet, surrounded by tall trees and charming houses. However, there was one neighbor who always seemed to be watching me. His name was Mr. Holloway, a man few knew well. He stood out not only for his disheveled appearance, but also for his peculiar behavior. The other residents of the neighborhood whispered about him, but I brushed it off as just urban legend. Before long, I began to notice his strange activities. He had a habit of watching the street at night, with his curtains drawn just enough to allow his eyes to peek out. Sometimes I would see him standing in the dark, just a silhouette, and a chill would run down my spine. I tried to ignore him, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. One night, while watching a movie at home, I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw Mr. Holloway digging a hole in his yard. It was late at night, and he was dressed in dark clothes, making the scene even stranger. I wondered what he was doing out there, but quickly convinced myself it was just a strange hobby. Still, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. As the weeks went by, the events grew stranger. I often heard sounds coming from his house, like he was dragging furniture or shouting. Whenever I tried to listen closely, the sounds would abruptly cut off, as if he were aware that someone was eavesdropping. One day, while coming home from work, I noticed the lights in Mr. Holloway's house were on, but he wasn't there. The feeling that he was always nearby, even when he wasn't, was disturbing. The turning point came on a stormy night. I was trying to sleep when a loud noise jolted me awake. It was a crash coming from Mr. Holloway's yard. I got up to investigate and looked out the window. The moonlight illuminated the garden, and I saw him again, digging. But something was different. He appeared more agitated, almost frantic. With rain pouring down and lightning flashing across the sky, a sense of urgency washed over me. I decided to call the police, but as I dialed, a shadow appeared behind him. I froze as I watched a hooded figure approach Mr. Holloway. They seemed to be arguing, but the storm drowned out their voices. The figure then pulled something from inside their cloak, and before I could react, Mr. Holloway collapsed. My heart raced as I called the police, and while I waited, I continued to watch. The hooded figure glanced in my direction, and I felt a chill as I realized I was being watched. They seemed to know I was there. As sirens began to wail, the figure vanished into the shadows of the nearby woods. When the officers arrived, I mustered the courage to step outside and walk to Mr. Holloway's yard, still hoping he was alive. The police found nothing but a shallow hole in the ground and a shovel left behind. Mr. Holloway was declared missing, And from that moment on, the story began to spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors started to distance themselves, and I felt guilty for not acting sooner. There was a sense that he was always around, even in his absence. At night, I would hear the same unsettling sounds, as if he were trying to communicate in some way. Days turned into weeks, and the situation only worsened. I started noticing strange marks in my yard, as if someone had been dragging themselves across the grass. Sometimes, when I was paying attention, I could swear I saw a shadow darting past my window. I couldn't sleep anymore, and paranoia took hold. It felt as though Mr. Holloway was still near, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. One night, I decided it was time to face my fears. With a flashlight in hand, I ventured into the yard. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When I approached the hole he had dug, something caught my attention. I looked down and saw something glimmering in the dirt. As I dug it out, I realized it was a necklace, the same one I had seen in an old photo of the house. Panic surged through me as I understood it belonged to one of the several people who had gone missing in the neighborhood over the years. Without thinking, I ran back inside and locked all the doors. What should have been a new beginning had turned into a nightmare, and the shadow of Mr. Holloway continued to haunt me. The neighborhood became a place of terror, and I knew that somehow he was still there, watching closely, waiting for his next victim. I woke up one night with a strange feeling that something wasn't right. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m., and an absolute silence hung in the air. I had always considered myself an anxious person, but something about that night left me restless, as if a primal instinct was alerting me to an imminent danger. I looked around, trying to find the source of that feeling, but everything seemed normal. My apartment was just as I had left it, and the sounds of the city outside were oddly comforting. I tried to go back to sleep, but the unease persisted. Then I heard a sound, a soft scratching coming from the hallway, as if something or someone was trying to open a door. My heart raced, and I forced myself to get out of bed. I slowly walked toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, and the light from my bedroom seemed almost unattainable. I reached the living room door, and with a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob. The sound had stopped, but the atmosphere was thick, almost charged. Breathing became difficult as I questioned whether I should really open the door. A part of me wanted to return to bed and hide under the covers, but another part was consumed by curiosity and the need to understand what was happening. Finally, I pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. The street light filtered through the curtains, revealing familiar furniture and the kitchen in sight. But something felt different. The sofa was out of place, and the coffee table was askew. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that things were not as I had left them. For the first time, the idea of an intruder crossed my mind. I looked around, but there were no obvious signs of a break-in. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling that someone was there, watching me, was palpable. I walked over to the window and looked outside, but the darkness of the night concealed any trace of life. Then I heard the noise again, this time from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was rummaging through my belongings. My mind was racing. I tried to remember if I had left the kitchen window open, but I couldn't recall. In a moment of bravery or desperation, I grabbed a knife from the drawer and headed toward the sound. With each step, the pounding of my heart grew louder, and I could barely hear my own thoughts. As I reached the kitchen door, I hesitated. The sound had suddenly stopped, and the silence was deafening. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. What I found made me freeze. The kitchen was in perfect order, but the window was open, the curtains swaying gently. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I decided it was time to call the police. My racing mind considered several possibilities. While I was dialing the number, I heard a noise, this time from my bedroom. It sounded like a whisper, a low and indistinct voice. Panic turned into absolute terror. I put the knife in front of me and prepared for whatever might come. As I waited for the operator to answer, a movement to my right caught my attention. A tall man, with a disheveled and gaunt appearance, was standing in the corner of the room, watching me. What terrified me the most was his smile. It was a grin that seemed to have been carved into his face, an expression of joy and malice at the same time. I tried to scream, but no words came out. The sight of the intruder paralyzed me. He didn't move, he just continued to watch me, as if he were enjoying my terror. Time seemed to slow down. Then, the police finally answered, but just as I was about to scream what was happening, the man took a step toward me. The operator heard my terrified whisper and began to ask what was happening, but I couldn't respond. My legs were frozen. As he took another step, a wave of adrenaline surged through me. I focused all my strength and ran toward the hallway. The man started to follow me, but I was determined to escape. The front door was just a few meters away, and with every step, the sense of relief began to mix with terror. When I finally reached the door, I managed to open it and run outside. The night's chill hit me like a punch, but I didn't stop to think. I ran to my car, opened the door, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back and saw the man at my apartment door, still watching me, his grin wide on his face. The police arrived quickly at the scene, but there was no sign of the intruder. After a thorough search, they found no one, and since my apartment showed no signs of a break-in, they couldn't do anything. The officer informed me that I should consider the possibility of it being a hallucination, but I knew what I had seen. In the following days, I couldn't return home. The terror of that man still haunted my thoughts. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw his grotesque smile, and the idea that he could return at any moment kept me on constant alert. After a few weeks, I decided to move, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to come back. The shadows never seemed so threatening, and the night became a constant reminder that there are things in the darkness we cannot understand. Even in a new place, the feeling of being pursued never left me. It was as if the intruder was always around, in every dark corner, waiting for the moment to return and make me remember the terror I had lived.